In 2008, excavations began at a 17th century cemetery located in Drawsko, Poland. To date, over 285 individual graves have been uncovered at the site, but 6 in particular stand out to archaeologists. Labeled as deviant burials, these 6 graves are unique due to the presence of farming sickles being laid across the bodies. There are no other differences between these 6 graves and the nearly 300 others located at the site, and so archaeologists began theorizing why these people were buried in such a way. Some thought that the sickles may be a sign of wealth. Others thought that they may symbolize the person was a farmer in their lifetime. But the prevailing theory hints at something a little bit stranger. Some historians believe that these 6 people were buried with sickles laid over their throats because their friends, their families, and their neighbors who laid them to rest feared that they may come back as a vampire. Hey, how's it going, gang? My name is Michael Walker, and today I would like to talk to you guys about the Drawsko vampires. Hopping right into it, the site in question, labeled Drawsko 1, is located on the eastern side of the modern village of Drawsko, Poland. For the most part, the graves at this site are pretty uniform. Most of the bodies were interred with the heads pointed towards the west or the setting sun, typical of Christian burials during this time. It has been determined that most of the people in this cemetery were buried inside of coffins, and the cemetery has been dated to the mid-1600s through the use of coins that were found in many of the graves, which were printed during the reign of King Jan Kazimierz. The 6 deviant burials that we will be discussing today were named based on when they were found. There's 28-2008, 29-2008, 24-2009, 60-2010, 6-2012, and 49-2012. Grave 28-2008 was a middle-aged adult male who had a sickle laid across his throat. Grave 29-2008 was an adolescent whose sex could not be determined, and instead of a sickle, they had a stone laid over their throat. Grave 24-2009 was an adult woman in her late 30s, and the curved sickle found in her grave was laid with the blade over her throat, and the handle pressed against her temple. Also, unfortunately, her skull was crushed in by what appears to be an accident caused by farming over the site in recent years. 60-2010 is the grave of an older woman in her 50s or 60s. She was buried with a sickle laid over her pelvis, with the blade pointed to the upper half of her body and a stone laid on her sternum. It is also worth noting that she suffered severe tooth loss before her death. 6-2012 was a teenage or young adult woman around 14 to 19 years of age. She was buried with a sickle laid over her throat and a copper band on her head. And finally, grave 49-2012 belongs to an adult woman, estimated to be in her 30s, with a large sickle laid over her throat as well. But what do these artifacts mean? Well, we know that they're at least not a rarity. Sickles have been found in graves from Germany, West Slovakia, Poland, and other areas sprinkled across Central Europe, dating as far back as the 7th century all the way up to the 18th century. Throughout all these burials, though, there doesn't seem to be any direct correlation between one's sex, age, region, or ethnicity, and whether or not they would be buried with a sickle. And on top of this, there doesn't seem to be any discernible differences between the people who were buried with sickles and those who were not at any given site. It's believed that the practice at least originated with medieval-era Slavic people, although the exact usage and symbolism of these sickles still remains a mystery. In the initial research put forth by Polchin et al., it was suggested that these sickles could have been a symbol that the person buried with them was a farmer during their lifetime. However, this theory was kind of debunked later in that same paper. You see, at the point in time that this cemetery was in use, Drawsko was a small farming village. Most people in the community would have been farmers. So if the sickles are meant to symbolize that you owned a farm, we would be seeing them everywhere. There was another theory put forward that these sickles aren't symbols of agriculture, but instead are symbols of war. You see, war scythes, essentially a sickle on a very long pole, were a popular weapon among Polish soldiers at this time, particularly amongst peasants. However, this theory is very unlikely because we are not looking at war scythes, we are looking at short-handle farming sickles. Also, they are being found in the graves of women and children who typically are not being shipped off to war. No, researchers seem to agree that these sickles are actually apotropaic artifacts. Now, if you're not familiar with the term apotropaic, it's okay. It's a very simple concept and one you're actually probably familiar with. See, apotropaic items are objects that are believed to have mystical or magical qualities about them that can repel things like bad luck, witchcraft, or demons and evil spirits. Think along the lines of like horseshoes, lucky rabbit's foot, good luck charm, dream catchers, crucifixes, and you have the right idea. The townspeople, for one reason or another, feared that these 6 individuals may come back as some sort of undead creature, and so they decided to place sickles over their throats so that if they tried to sit up, it would decapitate them. This is noticeably not the case with grave 60-20-10. Her sickle was placed over her hip in a way so that if she sat up, it would disembowel her. However, she was found with a stone laid on top of her sternum. This practice can also be seen in grave 29-2008, where a small child was buried with a stone placed over their throat. It is believed that these stones are also apotropaic in nature and that they're intended to prevent the deceased from feeding on the living by metaphorically blocking their throat. The distinctive method in which these artifacts were laid over the body seems to indicate that the community feared that these people may come back as vampires, or something like a vampire. Let me explain, because we're probably not talking about vampires in the sense that you are used to thinking about vampires. These early Slavic vampires had many different names and forms. There could be the homonymic vampire, or upir, or upior. They often lacked a physical body and could be invisible or appear as a walking corpse, and they're more akin to what we might recognize as a ghost or a demon instead of an actual flesh and blood monster. In fact, it was this very distinction that led researchers at the Drawsko site to reject outright calling them vampires, stating, quote, "We deliberately dismiss the interpretation of a revenant, i.e. vampire. There are a variety of demons into which the soul of the deceased may be transformed according to folk wisdom, with upior, or often referred to as a vampire, being just one of those. Thus, we prefer to classify the interments from Drawsko as anti-demonic." Now, there are several markers that would have led the people of Drawsko to fear that you may come back as some sort of restless spirit, such as physical deformities, dying without having been baptized, being the first person to die in a plague, suffering a bad death, such as drowning, or being an accused witch, or even just being an outsider in the community itself. Starting off, it is going to be very difficult to determine if these bodies had any physical abnormalities that would have stood out as a sign you may become a demon. Some visible signs would be things like having a large head, having extra teeth, or having a malformed spine or limbs, but these obviously are not present in any of the Drawsko burials. Likewise, villagers could have seen things like having red skin or excessive body hair or even a unibrow as a physical deformity worthy of concern. However, it would be impossible for us to determine if this was the case simply because we do not have any hair or skin remains to look at. All we have left to examine are the skeletal remains. Turning to the notion that these bodies could have been those of plague victims, it is going to be very difficult to directly tell if these people died from illness. This area had experienced large-scale cholera outbreaks in the past. However, cholera kills the person way too quickly to leave behind any noticeable changes in bones. So, the researchers at the Drawsko site decided to turn and look at all the other graves to see if they could provide any clues. It was determined that the burial rates at Drawsko 1 were not all that different from what you'd expect to find at any other cemetery. There were a large number of deaths in infants and small children. There were a large number of deaths in elderly adults, but there was a pretty big gap in between where very few people died in that older child, middle-aged adult range, which is to be expected. That's normal. Also, we would probably expect to find examples of mass graves here, where several people would be dumped into one giant hole on top of each other, but we don't seem to find any examples of mass graves or hasty burials at this site. In fact, most of the people buried in the cemetery seem to have been buried inside of coffins, which they would not have the time to make if they were dealing with a giant plague. Now, there is a caveat here. This doesn't necessarily rule out that some of the deaths at the Drawsko site could have been caused by illnesses or even small-scale plagues, and researchers overseeing the project point out that these 6 anti-demonic burials that we're discussing could have at least been the first individuals to die in those smaller instances. It's not concrete, but it is still a possibility. Okay, now this is the fun one. Were these 6 individuals accused of being witches? Probably not. As part of my research, I reached out to Professor Michael Osling of Arizona State University, who is an expert in researching witchcraft trials. He's skeptical of the idea that these are the graves of accused witches because, quite simply, these graves are pretty normal, actually. They were all oriented with their heads pointing towards the west, which, as we already discussed, was typical of Christian burials at this point in time. 5 of the graves were found to have copper stainings either inside or near the skulls, which indicates to archaeologists that they likely were buried with a coin inside their mouths. Now, it's still up for debate whether these coins were also apotropaic in nature or if they were just a kind gesture to a deceased loved one. The notion of burying someone with a coin has a long and complicated history, and the meaning behind it still isn't entirely understood. But at least here at Drawsko, it was not an uncommon practice. 36%, 1/3 of all of the bodies uncovered at Drawsko were found to have a coin placed either inside or near the skull. But most strikingly, given their locale and the time period in question, if these people were accused of being witches and they were executed for their crimes, they typically would have been burned at the stake, which, if that were the case, we would not be finding fully articulated skeletons. As always, though, there's a distinction to be made here. In the 17th century, there were various practices or forms of knowledge that would be practically indistinguishable from what we would consider magic. People considered as healers, they had this specialized knowledge that, while it wasn't outright malicious, it was still considered otherworldly and could lead to others in the community being fearful of them, and maybe even believing that they would return from the dead as a sort of restless spirit. Finally, were these the graves of people who were considered to be outsiders, essentially meaning that these people didn't necessarily fit into the defined social structure of Drawsko. Drawsko was a small farming village at this point in time, filled with serfs and peasant farmers who didn't do much outside of tending to their crops and livestock, and very few of them ever traveled far outside of the village that they were born in. So someone who had a different occupation, say like a cobbler or a hunter, they would be considered an outsider. They're unique, strange. They're different from us, and that makes them an outsider. Or they could have been a literal outsider, someone who was born somewhere else and traveled into Drawsko for some reason, and they happened to end up passing away there. At this point in time, there isn't really enough information to determine the occupation that these people had, but some research has been put forward into determining their origins. Studies have been performed on the dental enamel of nearly 60 individuals at the Drawsko site, including graves 28 2008, 24 2009, and 49 2012. See, once a person's dental enamel finishes developing, its chemical makeup remains the same all throughout their life. However, humans finish developing their teeth in early childhood. The chemical makeup of our enamel is based off of what we ingest. The things that we eat contain different amounts of different elements, which are determined by what's available in our immediate environment. Keeping these ideas in mind, researchers determined that if these 6 people were in fact from somewhere else, or at least grew up somewhere else, then the chemical makeup of their dental enamel should be noticeably different from other people buried at this same site. So, what did they find? Interestingly enough, after inspecting the strontium isotopes represented in the dental enamel of these 60 bodies, it was determined that graves 28 2008, 24 2009, and 49 2012 did not have drastically different amounts of strontium than other graves in the area. This indicates that these three bodies at least lived in or near the village of Drawsko, and so should not have been considered outsiders, at least in a physical sense. To sum things up, while these stones and sickles likely were some form of apotropaic artifact intended to keep the body from returning as some sort of restless spirit, the exact reason why they were included in the graves is still very much up for debate. Researchers mostly agree that these people were considered at risk for becoming vampires due to some sort of social factor, be it their occupation or something that they did in their lives that was considered strange or socially unacceptable. Something that, unfortunately, appears to have not left behind a physical trace. But there is still more to learn. In the grand scheme of things, this is a fairly new archaeological site, and archaeology can be a long and tedious process. You also have to keep in mind that archaeologists aren't studying these 6 bodies, they are studying over 280 bodies at this site in order to learn about the people of Drawsko as a whole. And as we continue to learn more and more about this site, and as more fine-tuned and in-depth archaeological methods are being applied, surely there will be more for us to unearth about the Drawsko vampires. Wait, and there we go. It has been determined that most of the bears, there are bears. Oh no, I scared my dog. I'm sorry, baby. I love you. Drawsko. Drawsko? There's so much I have to learn how to pronounce for this video. It's not even great. It's not even real. Something tells me that's not how you pronounce that. Kazimierz. Kazimierz. Okay. Kazimierz. Got it. I'm learning Polish.